So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Silex, how to go from micro framework, which Silex is natively, to a full stack. So how do you add features and evolve it for real-world applications? So a little bit about me. I'm a developer evangelist at AppDynamics. We do application performance monitoring for PHP. Before that, I was doing consulting and training at SymfonyLive in the US. So really the creators of Symfony, as you know, and really focused on Symfony 2 training, Silex training, Doctrine, et cetera. And then before that, I was a developer evangelist at Yahoo. When I was at Yahoo, I originally brought in Symfony to Yahoo to build Yahoo Answers and Delicious, which were really just prototypes to try to have Yahoo standardize on a PHP framework. So that's really my history in the Symfony community. So what is Silex? How many of you are familiar with Sinatra, Express, or Flask? All right. How many of you have already used Silex? OK. So as you know, Silex is a micro framework for PHP 5.3 and above. It's really based on the Symfony 2 components, and it's really easy to install and get started with Composer. Created by Fabian and Igor, who I believe are in the audience somewhere. And it's licensed under MIT license, so you're free to use it however you want, as long as you give attribution. Find out more at silex.sensiolabs.org. So a little bit about the philosophy. Silex, being a micro framework, has some limitations. Silex will never support some of the following, like a command line tool natively, or features that require external configuration files like XML or YAML or INI. Any feature that's not really PHP-ish, like annotations or native PHP. And any feature that adds a lot of code to the Silex core. The whole goal is that it's small, very lightweight micro framework, very similar to Sinatra or Express. So why use Silex? A full stack framework is very much overkill for a lot of common tasks. So the core idea of Silex is really easily to map routes to controllers. So I want slash to return hello world. The whole goal is to be concise, extensible, and testable. So I've stolen all of this presentation and all of the code examples from the awesome open source community. So feel free to clone the repository on GitHub/Dustin Whittle. OK, so to get started, I assume everyone's very familiar with Composer. If not, it's very easy to install Composer to get started. Just curl-s, get composer.org/installer. Once you have that, you can really create a composer.json file. All you really need to specify here is Silex as a dependency. So can't point, but basically the only thing that's mandatory here is Silex/Silex 1.0, or whatever version makes sense for your project. By default, there's no real structure. The only thing that you have with the Silex application is an index.php. So it's very simple and straightforward to get started. You have your Composer.json file, which describes your dependencies. You have an index.php, which is very straightforward. So when you look at the micro framework for Silex, it really looks like this. You include the autoloader just so you know how to discover and load classes. And then you can simply create a Silex application, which is app silex/application. And then you define your routes, or you map routes to controllers. In this case, we're just going to do hello world, so it's extremely simple. We have app-get, and then the route name, /hello, that takes an optional parameter called name. And then we're going to pass this to a controller, which in this case is just a function that accepts the parameter name, uses the application, so we expose the Silex application, and then we just return straight text, hello, and then escape the parameter name. What does this look like, you ask? Really straightforward. /hello/SymfonyLive returns just the text hello SymfonyLive. That's all there is to Silex. It's really straightforward. To start with, all you need is these methods. So you have Silex application, app-get, hello name, and you can do this as much as you want. You can chain all these together to create a simple application. But what about when you want to do more with that? So by default, Fabian has created a nice Silex skeleton. So if you want to bootstrap a project with Silex, you can use Composer to do so. It's really easy. You just do composer.var, create-project, and then the path, fabpot/silex-skeleton. What this will give you is a basic structure for creating a Silex project that's very simple. So at its simplest, it looks like this. But when you need to add more, you need some basic structure. With Silex, there's no structure to begin with. With the Silex skeleton, you provide a basic structure for an application. So what do you need? You need a place to have configuration, a configuration for production, a configuration for development. You need an app directory. If you want, you can have your own console command. Just because we say you shouldn't use a console doesn't mean you can't accomplish it with Silex. It's really easy to do. Again, Silex is really just Symfony components underneath, so you can use any component you need. So in this case, we have a source app, a source console, controllers for just a way to categorize our controllers, or a place to put our controllers, rather, and then some Twig templates. In this case, we have a template for 404, 500, an index, and a generic layout that you can use. So if you're familiar with Twig, the rest of this will feel very native. And then several front controllers, one for production, index.php, and another one with development options enabled, index_dev.php. So what does this look like? If you go and run composer.var create-project with fabpot/Silex skeleton, you'll get this directory structure, and this is what it'll look like in the UI. So it's really basic. It comes with essentially a hello world, and it provides basic features. So if you're familiar with Symfony 2's debugging utilities and pretty exception pages, you get all of that native with Silex. So when you have a 404, it renders the 404 page. When you have an exception, you get the exception page. But you need to often add features with providers. So a provider exposes functionality to a Silex application. So sometimes you need to generate URLs. Sometimes you need sessions. Sometimes you want forms and validation. Each one of these are additional providers. With Silex, you turn features on. With Symfony 2, you disable features, or you turn features off. So Pimple is a simple dependency injection container, which is the core of Silex. And it uses some of the community providers to add functionality that isn't available in the core. So if you're familiar with Symfony 2 and you're familiar with Symfony 2 bundles, this should feel very similar. So core service providers. A lot of these are pretty standard, or what you're going to need to build an application. So you need a way to do routing. So how do you do URL generation? How do you do sessions? How do you actually manage state in PHP? Forms and validation, security, translations, HTTP cache, Twig, Monolog, Doctrine if you need data access or an ORM, and Swift Mailer. So how do you add a feature? So this is what a provider looks like. So this is the router. Everyone's going to need URL generation of some kind. So a really easy way to do this is you have an app, and you simply register additional providers. So if we take a look, nothing happens in this application until you call run. So I can add as many providers as I want here, and as many URLs, and as much structure. And once I call run, it's actually going to process the request and do what it needs to do. So we get started with a core service like routing. And in order to use it, you simply use app. And then app is actually a container, a service container. That's Pimple working. So app and then Twig. If you're familiar with Symfony 2, you call render. It's the same idea, same exact concept. So here we want to use a route where you simply just want to generate a template and use a reference inside of this template. So here we're going to create a route, and we're going to call the URL generator and generate a route to the home page. Pretty straightforward. So what you'll notice here is that when we define the route, we actually bind it to a name. That's what's actually using the URL generation service. So here, when we call render this template, so this is where we're returning this HTTP response from a template. But here, when we define the route app get, we're simply calling bind homepage. And now if I ever want to reference this URL later, I can simply call URL generator, generate homepage. And that'll give me the URL for this route. So how about sessions? Most PHP applications need some sort of session state. This is extremely easy. Again, what you'll notice throughout the slides is everything's based on Symfony 2 components. So if you've used it in Symfony 2, it's going to be almost identical in Silex. So here we're going to simply enable the session service provider. And that gives us the session service. And now we can set and get state from the session. So in this case, I just want to set for user. Username is SymfonyLive. And we want to get this later. We simply call app session get user. Now, Twig isn't required. You can use whatever templating language you want. By default, there is a Twig service provider that's really easy to turn on. Again, with all of these, you simply call app register, the service provider, path in a path to your templates, and then you can start using the Twig service. So before, in the hello world example, instead of returning a template, we just return straight text. It creates an HTTP response. And in this case, we want to render a template. So we'll just call the Twig service render, and it'll actually use the Twig service to generate the HTML and return that as an HTTP response. Translations are very similar. Translations are extremely easy. So the idea with Silex, Symfony 2, all the conventions are decided for you. All the structure, all the decisions are already made. With Silex, you start with nothing, and you decide everything. You decide what services you need, you decide the conventions, the structure, where all the files live, etc. So really, you decide what services do you need for your project, aka what features do you need, and then you simply register all of those service providers, and then you can start using them through your app, whatever the service name is, and whatever you need. So in this case, we're going to add translations. So we'll use the translation service provider, and we'll set the default locale to English. In this case, we'll register a dictionary, so translation.domains, with support for English and French. And then whenever you need to reference it, just like you use the trans Twig tag, you can call app translator trans and then the text. So now we have a Hello World app that supports both English and French very easily, and 20 lines of code. Forms are where things get a little bit more complicated. It's actually changed a bit, but the general idea is the same as Symfony 2. When you create a form, you use the form factory to build a form. You register what elements you want, their different types, and then how to validate them. In this case, we're simply going to create a contact form, so /match/contact, and then use the form factory to generate a form. In this case, it consists of a name, an email address, and a gender, which is a choice list of male or female. And by default, we want it expanded. So if you're familiar with the Symfony 2 Forms API, all of this should feel the exact same. And the reason is because it's the same code underneath. And just like in Symfony 2, we check the request method. If the request method is a post, we bind the form, we validate the form. If the form is valid, we do something with the data. Otherwise, we show the form again, this time with errors. And we're also using Twig in this case. So we're simply going to call Twig render, the template that we want to render, and then we're going to pass in a form as an element to that view. Any questions so far? All right. So how about adding a validator to this form that we've just created? In this case, we'll create the form factory, the same thing with the builder. We create a name, which is by default a text element, but this time we're going to add constraints. So in this case, we want to assert that it's not blank and it has a minimum length. The same for the email. We want to assert that it's an email address and that the email address is valid. And then we want to assert for the gender that the choices match what we've already passed in. So in this case, validate whether it's male or female. Then we'll take the form, just like we did before, pass it into a Twig template. And our Twig template we'll use, just like we would in Symfony 2, a form widget that's going to render the form. Pretty straightforward. All right, so how many of you use HTTP caching? 2, 3, that's it? OK, all of you should be using HTTP caching. There's no reason not to. But it's really easy to do in Twig. You simply register the HTTP cache service provider, pass in a cache directory to write your files to, and then you can generate an HTTP response, and it will be cached by default. Now, a lot of times you need database access. The database access is really straightforward. In this case, we're not using the Doctrine ORM, but rather the Doctrine database abstraction layer, which gives us a raw PDO connection. So in Silex, there's not full support for an ORM by default. The Doctrine service provider really just provides an abstraction over the PDO object, which is essentially what Doctrine's DBAL does. Here, we're going to register the Doctrine service provider, pass in an array of options. In this case, the options are I want to use the PDO SQLite driver, and I want to pass a path to my database. In this case, it's the current directory /app.db. Now, when I want to run a query or execute a query, I can simply use the app.db service, which is essentially a PDO object, and then pass SQL queries directly to it. So in this case, I fetch association, so fetch associative array, to select star from table. Now, if we want to use this in our actual code, a simple JSON API would look like this. Whenever I do a /get to /todo/some identifier, I want to run select star from to-do where ID equals whatever I've passed in. And I want to run app.db, fetch associative with SQL, and then in this case, I'm just going to cast an ID to an int and pass it in. If no to-do exists, I want to abort and throw a 404 error. Otherwise, I want to return app.json. So there are some shortcut methods just for convenience. Like I could call return HTTP response JSON encode to-do. There's a shortcut for that, app-json to-do. You just pass in the to-do object. So Monolog, everyone needs logging. I think it's essential. Again, very straightforward. All these are the same. App register, add some service provider, enable some feature, and then pass in some data. So here we're going to register the Monolog service provider. We're going to pass in monolog.log file, which tells us where should we be writing these logs to. And then we can leverage this with the Monolog service, app, Monolog, add debug. So add a debug level message with, oh my God, SymfonyLive. So another common feature is email. Again, like the rest of these, email is straightforward. You simply register the Swift Mailer service provider, and then you can use Swift Mailer natively. So in this case, we're making a post. When I get the data to posts/feedback, I want to create a new email message and send. So in this case, I just create a Swift message with a new instance with the subject from to body, and then I can reply with the mailer service. So mailer, send, and then the email message that I've created with Swift Mailer. So security. I used to say that you shouldn't use Silex if you need security. I've since backtracked on this one a little bit. It's really straightforward to do in Silex. You simply register the security service provider, register a firewall, and then you can use app security to get a user's token or identifier. This is really convenient if you're building a simple REST API and you want to use like something like OAuth security on top. It's very easy to apply here. But, well, I'll just get to it later. So what is a full stack framework? Full stack framework provides some default structure, default conventions. Usually with that comes configuration over convention. So there's some default configuration. Otherwise, the rest is assumed based on conventions. In Symfony 2, again, you remove features. In Silex, you start with nothing and you add them. With Silex, you start with no default structure, no default conventions. You just define where everything lives. So if you need to make Silex work for a larger project, you have to put more thought into it. How should the controllers be set up? How do I do configuration? How do I handle internationalization? Where do dictionaries live? How do I set up HTTP caching? Where does that live? With Silex, all of those decisions you have to make manually. With Symfony 2, all of those defaults are already there. So if you need to choose between Symfony 2 or Silex, that's what I think you should consider. How much of this do you want to be done for you? So Symfony 2, there's a large community that's gone into deciding these defaults based on what people need the most. And that's where all this comes from. So how do you scale Silex for a larger application? You expose new functionality with service providers. This is extremely easy to do. But again, Silex starts with just a single file. It's a micro framework. All it does is provides a dependency injection container and a way to map URLs to controllers, or URLs to methods, routes to methods. So as you scale up, you need to move out of a single file, because if you have a real application, you don't want a 10-mile-long file or 10,000-line file. So how do you put controllers in a different place? How can you use a real templating layer like Twig? And how do you add support for database and caching? So we already talked a bit about database and caching, but let's talk about scaling Silex for larger applications. So there's a lot of different extensions available for Silex. In this case, there's Static, Memcache, MongoDB, Redis, Markdown. Pretty much anything you can think of that works for Symfony 2 you can find a service provider for it for Silex. But I'm going to walk through creating your own provider, because a lot of times that's what you're going to want to end up doing, whether it's for doing controllers, whether it's for creating your own controller structure or just exposing a third-party library. So you can integrate any third-party library very easily by adding a service to the container. In this case, I'm just going to simply walk through a Facebook SDK, because I think a lot of people have probably already used it before. So the dependency injection container in Silex is much simpler than you're probably used to in Symfony 2. There's no compiler pass, there's no XML and YAML, there's no loader extensions, right? All you have is service provider class and a container. So what does this look like? So by default, for the Facebook SDK, you simply require create a new Facebook instance, and you pass in your app ID and secret. It's really straightforward. It doesn't get easier. But how about when we want to make this service available to all of our application in Silex? So this really comes down to app share. This is what's going to expose the service Facebook. So what we're saying is app Facebook is a shared version of the service. So app share, use the context of the app, and then return a new instance of Facebook, passing in the app ID and the secret. So in order to do this, we actually have to create a service provider. Service provider is a lightweight wrapper that shows Silex how to register your service with the service container. In this case, we're just going to create a class Facebook service provider that implements the service provider interface. The service provider interface simply implements the register method. In this case, you can call app Facebook, app share, return new Facebook. So if I want to do this one time in my project, I can simply do this at the top and register the Facebook service directly with the container. But if I want to make this reusable and say upload a Facebook service provider to GitHub for other people to use, I need to add a little bit more structure. And that's where the Facebook service provider class comes in. So again, it's the same logic that we've used for app share, except for it's abstracted through a class. So here we simply have function register that takes an application instance, and it's the same exact code. App share, a new instance of the Facebook class with an app ID and an app secret. It's really straightforward. Now, when I want to use this in my application, just like all the other service providers, we simply call app register, new SymfonyLive Facebook service provider, and we pass in a Facebook app ID and a Facebook secret. Now, whenever we want, we can use this inside of our application. So in this case, I'm just mapping a home page or the / URL, and I want to return some user data. So by default, with the Facebook SDK, when you call getUser, if a user's not authenticated, it'll end in a redirect to the Facebook API to authenticate the user, and the end result of that will be redirected back to your application with a Facebook session. So here, if I want to be able to have all users log into the application with Facebook, it's quite simple. I can register the Facebook service provider, call Facebook getUser, and then once you're authenticated, it will return a JSON blob of your profile. So that's the basics behind creating reusable services in Facebook. So I know I'm going a little bit fast, so feel free to jump out with any questions. With the kitchen sink, I think this is the best example because it provides all the features you're probably going to need for a real project. This awesome person, who I have no idea what their real name is, but GitHub/Lyrics, has created a great project called Silex Kitchen Edition. It essentially provides HTML5 boilerplate with Twitter Bootstrap with a bunch of different providers enabled by default and some examples. So if you're really looking to get started, the best way to do it is to use this line to create a new Silex project. So Composer, create-project, lyrics/silex-kitchen-edition. And what this will give you is a project that looks like this. It's basically usage by example, or Silex by example. So it has examples for Twig, cache, form, session, translations, aesthetic, and doctrine. Most of the features that you're already used to in Symfony. And let's take a look at what this actually looks like. Please bear with me since I can't see this too well. Is that legible for everyone? All right. So basically, this is our app PHP. This is basically encapsulation of everything that's in our app. So all we're doing here is registering a bunch of Silex services. So just like I went through all the examples earlier, we're going to register the session service. We're going to register the validator, forms, URL generation, Twig, the security firewall, etc. So this is basically Silex with every possible default service turned on. This is a great way to get started. So each one of these takes some specific set of options. Again, Monolog takes a file, a name, possible level. Twig takes options for where do I look up the templates, the path, etc. All of these are basically the same. You can look up all the configurations on silex.sensiolabs.org. But let's take a more interesting look at the controllers. So this is where the real application logic comes in. In this case, we have a controllers.php, so we can encapsulate all the routes to methods in this one class. And then we have a bunch of examples. So on the home page, I just want to do something with the flash bag. Actually, this is a little bit out of date. But I want to essentially work with the session, grab some data from the session, and print it out. It's pretty straightforward. And here's what it looks like. So the beauty of GitHub is that none of these examples have to be written by me. The community's there, so thank you, all of you. But basically, here's us interacting with the session. So we're just looking for a message. If there's a message in there, we're printing it out. And then we have a hello world example that uses security. Now, if we take a look at the code again, we're simply accessing the session, grabbing some data. So we're simply adding a warning, adding an info, adding a success message so that we can use it in our Twig template, index.html.twig. Then we go to resources. Can't read anything in here. Open up the Twig view, and this should look very familiar. So just like in Symfony 2, you have all the power of Twig, so you have Twig layouts. You can do whatever you want. Here we're simply extending the layout.html, and then we're updating the block content to include our session messages. So if you're authenticated, I want to show you a name. Otherwise, I want to log out. And if we take a look at the layout, we'll see where we add success messages globally. So here we go. So basically, for each alert and alert type, I want to look through the session to see if I have an alert of that kind, like success or error, et cetera, and just print it out on a layout level. So this is a really good way to get an example. We'll show you how to do all the session storage, how to work with sessions, how to work with HTTP cache, how to work with forms as well. So again, if we take a look at a forms example, all of this should look very familiar. Simply pass in a form, and I get out the data. So if we go back to the controller for this class, the controller for this view, we have a form with a bunch of different elements. But if you use forms in Symfony 2, it's all the exact same code underneath. Pretty straightforward stuff. Most of the times, I think a good application is built with a JSON backend and something like Backbone or Ember or Angular to glue together the views from a REST API. So Silex is a compelling use case for building REST APIs where you're going to use something like Ember or Backbone to build the actual UI on top of it. So there's another great project called Silex Backbone To-Do List, which does exactly this. It takes Silex to build a REST API, which is pretty straightforward, and then Bootstrap to provide some generic style, and Backbone to build all the JavaScript application logic. Pretty straightforward, looks like this. This is really just powered by a to-do list API. So if we take a look at the code, what you'll see is a different configuration and a different structure, hopefully. And here, this project has a completely different structure compared to the one we were just looking at, where now I have essentially a to-do module or a to-do bundle, which is essentially a directory here, which has a to-do controller, which is essentially a REST API, all right? And some related views like a model, to-do list model. So it's pretty straightforward, plain old PHP object with some to-do list properties. And really all we're going to use Silex for is to map this to a REST API. So we have an API controller here. Just like this, all it's doing is mapping /API/to-do with a GET request to this method, list to-dos. And it's doing the same thing for each API method, or for each HTTP method. In this case, get, put, delete, and post. So in list to-dos, it's pretty straightforward. A REST API is I just want to select star from to-do, and take the results of that and encode them as JSON and output them. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So list to-do simply uses the PDO service, or otherwise the Doctrine DBAL service. So I'm accessing this through app.db. And I'm simply calling select star from to-do, order by is finished. And I'm doing fetch all with a PDO fetch class. So PDO will map all of these to this class name, which is new to-do. And the response is simply a JSON encode of that. So now we have a really lightweight JSON API for our to-dos. Now if we take a look at create, update, and delete, they're all going to be the same. So get to-do simply does to-do lookup by ID. So select star from to-do where ID equals whatever ID I pass here, and then return JSON encode. This is a very lightweight REST API. Add is the same thing. Take to-do and create it from the JSON data that I've posted. So JSON decode this request content and simply create a new to-do list class from that, and then persist the class. The same for update, the same for delete. And now if we take a look at JavaScript behind this, so we create a Backbone to-do template, and then we simply pass in all of our data, and we build out different prototypes for each different view that we want. I won't dive into the JavaScript bit, because that's not the bit you care about. The core idea is that you can create a very lightweight REST API for Silex, and I think that's a compelling use case. So what it looks like is you have a new to-do list. You can simply post this. It'll use the post API underneath to persist this data. So when does Silex make sense? For simple applications. I used to say that Silex is not a good fit if you require security, but I think the real decision maker for Silex versus Symfony 2 is whether you want to define the conventions or not. All the decisions for conventions are made for you in Symfony 2, and Silex you start with nothing and you define your own. So if you have a large project and you want the freedom and flexibility to do whatever you want, Silex is likely a better starting point. Underneath, it's just Symfony 2 components anyways, so it's really easy to adapt. RESTful applications are really good. RESTful APIs, rather, are really good, are really easy to build with Silex. So it makes them very easy to iterate on. And Silex can replace Symfony 2. So there's no compelling reason to choose one over the other unless you want to alter the configurations. Most of these configurations can be altered in Symfony 2 anyways. It just requires a lot more work because the defaults are already there.
Is it good practice to use this for prototyping a Symfony 2 application?
Sure. The caveat is that if you know you're going to switch to Symfony 2 in the end anyways, you're going to write all the same code, so you might as well start with Symfony 2. Like if you know the plan is to use Symfony 2 as the end result, start with Symfony 2. Silex makes it really easy if you're unsure, but you know you want to start with something minimal and evolve it. But once you get to a certain point where you need all of that structure, it's probably easier just to start with Symfony 2. Any other questions? It's not all ask at once. So who uses Silex? A ton of people use Silex. Everybody from BBC News, Sensio Labs, obviously, Nelmio, Leap, KMP Labs especially. There's a bunch of large companies that use basically Symfony 2 and Silex underneath. When to use a full stack, this is a little bit out of date, but generally I believe that if you need a more powerful service container, you should use Symfony 2 by default because you have Symfony 2's service container. You have Symfony 2's dependency injection container. Or if you need a full ORM. So if you need the full power of Doctrine and you need that structure, it's likely better to start with Symfony 2. Support's really easy. Again, if all of you are part of the Symfony community, you know that if you have questions, you want documentation, the documentation is stellar. The community is amazing. I never have to pay anyone to ask a question. I simply go into the IRC channel, ask randomly, and somebody comes to me, gives me a magical answer. So you can go to Silex PHP on irc.freenode. You can post an issue on GitHub if you have any problem, or you can just use the mailing list. Find out more at silex.sensiolabs.org. Again, great documentation, cookbooks for a lot of common problems, like how do I send email, how do I handle authentication, how do I build a form, etc. Just like you're used to in the Symfony 2 community, the Silex documentation is excellent. If you want to contribute, github.com/fabpot/silex. Again, just like the Symfony 2 community, follow the guidelines. Your pull requests will be accepted. If you'd like to find these slides, please find them on speakerdeck.com/Dustin Whittle. And let me know if you have any questions.
There used to be a couple of security providers around the Google or one of them I noticed is the other one lost track. Do you know if they anything that you would advise?
Sadly, I have no idea. But I can follow up after this. Igor's running around here somewhere. He's not in the room, but he'd be the authority. So special thanks to Fabian, Hugo, and Igor. Most of this content comes from them. Almost all of these examples come from other people, so really the shout-outs go to them. If you ever have any questions or I could be of any help, get in touch, dustinwhittle.com, @DustinWhittle at Twitter, or dustin.whittle@Symfony. And if you're here and you're unemployed and you want to change that, I can pretty much get you a job anywhere in the world, so just get in touch. Everyone here is hiring. Thank you very much.